right, everyone. So once again, thank you all for joining this webinar on managing your model with Autodesk Advanced Steel. My name is Tommy Moussis. I'm a customer success manager and local product manager here for Graitec. My main focus is on all products in the Autodesk and Graitec portfolio that encompass structural steel. So anything from design to detailing to fabrication, that's my main focus. Now, before we actually jump into the webinar, this is just a reminder that now we have the new Advanced Steel content portal. So now you can go over to our content portal, watch older webinars, training tutorials, plus other videos on tips and tricks, etc. And if you haven't already subscribed to our blog, you'll be able to do so here with this link. Now, of course, you'll have access later on to this PowerPoint from the content portal. So please do check it out at a later date. And also, just a quick reminder for the upcoming webinars, we do have one tomorrow on cold rolled with a power pack for Advanced Steel, and we have some other ones coming at later dates in April. So please do check them out. And of course, in this PowerPoint, we have embedded links, so you'll be able to subscribe to them later. Now, so today's topic, we're going to be talking about managing your model with Autodesk Advanced Steel. So this is quite a broad topic, of course. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Project Explorer, the model browser, and how you can leverage these tools to facilitate the searching for specific data later on in the project or extracting bill of materials, drawings, things of that type. We'll also take a look a little bit at creating approval statuses and comments later on. But first, what we're going to dive into is, of course, the Project Explorer. So we're going to take a look at how to create model views, queries, how to create folders for those queries as well, creating groups. Also, we're going to take a look at how we can save these queries to the DWT. And also, if you're a CAD manager and on a project you want to create a new query and share it with other users, how you'd be able to create a query, export it, and import it into another project. Then after that, we're going to be taking a look at the model browser. So of course, how to add in additional columns of information. So tailor the model browser to your specific needs. How we can edit the properties via the model browser. So if you made a mistake in your project, for example, left out a phase or some sort of property within the Advanced Properties dialog, we're going to take a look at how we can edit those properties within a component via the model browser. We're going to find, or we're going to take a look at finding items that have not been linked to drawings. So this is just another example of using the model browser, sort of a tip and trick scenario. Filtering based off of main part and single parts. What's the difference in specific cases? Why would you want to filter based off of single parts or main parts? And the benefits, of course. So at the end of creating all these filters and model views, etc., we're to take a look at how we can create drawings off the model views, how we can extract external lists based off of queries, and of course, how we can navigate and edit data after drawings have been created if you need to modify or make quick modifications, revisions, etc. All right, so let's just jump right into the model. Here I have an example with queries already predefined, and I do have some groups here at the bottom as well. Now this is just a quick example. So groups will allow you to isolate your model. Queries will allow you to do that as well, but of course there's other advantages. And here we're to go ahead and just see the difference. I have a model here. Without any model views, queries or groups applied. So we're to take a look at just starting off by creating model views. So start by model views, then work our way to queries, and then to groups here at the bottom and see what the difference is between the three. Now, this dialog here, if you're wondering where that or how to make that appear on your screen, of course, that's coming from the Project Explorer. So you'll find the Project Explorer in the Home ribbon. And here, of course, you can access different portions of the Project Explorer by just clicking on the pull down below. I personally just go ahead and click on the Project Explorer just to access everything here. Now you have two tabs at the bottom, structures and work planes. Today we're not going to be focused on work planes. We're just going to be focused on structures and adding model views, queries, and groups. okay? Now, you can always create a model view query or a group just by right-clicking on the category on the pull-down menu, and then here you'll have an option for creating levels. Now, we're not going to talk about that today. We're just going to talk about creating model views. We just simply won't have time to go through all aspects. So you can create a model view from here, or you can also create a model view from your advanced tool palette. So in the advanced tool palette, if we went under quick views, you'll then find this tool here, create model views. Now, after clicking on create model view, you have 4 options. So we'll go through these 4 options to see what the difference is. So here we have 1 point in UCS, we have 2 points in UCS plus front and rear depth. So essentially the difference between these two is, of course, you can adjust your model view in terms of a height restriction or your depth restriction in Z. And then here we have at grid line and at joint box. So first I'll start off with 1 point in UCS. And what we have to do first is, of course, modify the position of our UCS, set it at the correct elevation. So what I'll do is just take my UCS and move it at top of steel here. So just place it somewhere there along the top flange. And now I can go ahead back to the quick views tab and create my model view. So here we're to select 1 point in UCS. And of course, you can just pick any reference point. Most users tend to align these with UCS World. Here for this example, I'm just going to go ahead and use this corner point reference of my column. And now I'm going to give it a view name. So we'll just go ahead and call this level 1. Now that I've created level 1, it's going to provide me with some view directions. Okay, so this view direction is going to be the default view when double clicking on the model view later on. So if I were to select here this plan view, every time I double click on the box that links to the model view, it'll always isolate my model in plan. So now that that's set, here under model views, if we click on this pull down, we'll then see level 1 is created. Now, if I double click on this box, of course, it's only showing me what's within the model view. Okay, this is by as default when using 1 point at UCS. Now, of course, we can make modifications to the restrictions. And of course, in this case, we can only double click on the item to isolate. And if we were to double click again, it would show the rest of the model. So it works a little bit different than, let's say, a joint box where you can double click on it and access the properties. Here, in order to access the properties, you must select the item and then here go to advanced properties to make a change. Now here we have our width and our height and our depth restriction. Now, of course, you can modify the width and the height and depth. However, going to the clipping properties is much easier to manage if you just want to not set a restriction in X and Y and just have your depth restriction in Z. So here I can uncheck clip right, bottom, left, and top. And then here towards the bottom, we'll have our camera properties. This will come back to later on when we use the model views to create drawings. So now, again, if I were to double click on the box, it's going to zoom in at that location. However, we can see the model, we can see that now we're showing the whole floor plan for level 1. Also, there's other changes that you can make here. If you made a mistake, for example, with the view direction of the model view, here you can go to change default view direction and select another view if you made a mistake. So here, of course, I'm just going to keep it at the plan. And now if I double click, of course, it's going to retain those adjustments that I made earlier in depth restriction. And that's an example of creating a level with 1 point at UCS. Now here you do have some options if you were to right click on level 1 within the model view. So here, of course, you can turn it on, off, you can erase, you can rename it, you can check it out and have a partial checkout. Those things I'll go over later on. Okay, so let's have another example of 2 points in UCS front and rear depth. Now I'm going to go ahead and adjust my UCS to the next level here. So we're going to place it to top of steel on this balcony or platform. And now we're going to select again, create model view. Okay, so here are 2 points in UCS front and rear depth. Now here you got to remember that it's going to be based on 2-point selection, so you can always adjust the 2-point selection afterwards. Of course, if you don't have all members within the box, you can always adjust it via the grips. We're going to take a look at that in a second. And here we have our front and rear depth, so we can just use the default. And I'm going to give it a name. Of course, we're going to call it level 2 in this case. And now, once again, we're going to select our view direction. And now if I were to double click on this item, of course, we can see here that we're missing a portion of the balcony. So what we could do is just double click to show the rest of the model. Notice here I did have grips, and we could just take the grips and adjust accordingly. You can also move your model view. So just to give an example, if I were to use the move command, you can simply displace it like so, on the left or right hand side. You can always change it in elevation as well that way. So if you ever make a mistake, you can always just adjust it afterwards. All right. So now that that's done, if I were to, of course, double click on it, it's going to isolate it in plan again. And here, if I were to highlight it and right click, of course, we can go to the advanced properties. And now here you'll see that we have the same options, okay, for clipping, top, right, bottom, and towards the left. However, in this case, we sized it accordingly in our depth restriction. So there's no need to modify this further. And now here we have our levels defined. So I'm going to double click on this model view, show the rest of my model, and now we'll take a look at the other 2 options here. So if I click on, create model view again, here we have a grid line and a joint box. Now a grid line, we're isolating our model typically, or not typically, always in elevation. And a joint box is be different, of course. Again, we're isolating connections at different floors. So you probably want to place these model views in different folders and categorize them. Here under the model views tab, you can create folders as well as new model views, of course. So here we're just going to create a folder. And here for this folder, you can call it plan views. And I could just drag and drop my model views into that category. Now we can minimize that folder, and we can go ahead and create model views at grid lines now. So I'm going to select that grid line, and here select grid line 1. Now I'm going to give it a name. Of course, we can call it grid 1. And once again, it's going to ask me to select the view. So here I'm going to isolate it in elevation. And it's not going to create, it's going to create a box, of course, that contours the grid line, but there's no depth restriction in Z. That's going to be automatic. Now here we can isolate our model inside elevation. So here we see grid 1, and I'm going to go ahead and just create them quickly for 2, 3, and 4. So again, I'm going to select grid line 2, type in grid 2, select the side elevation, and quickly go over to 3. And 4. There we go. So now we have grid 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, the properties stay the same. If I were to just double click, again, it's going to isolate my model in the side elevation. And, and here, of course, if I were to go into the advanced properties, we're to see the same exact options. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder and just call it grid lines, or you can call it elevations, whatever you'd like. So here, I'm just going to call it grid lines. And once again, we're going to drag and drop them into that folder. All right, now for connections. Now connections specifically, I prefer not to create model views for connections. I prefer to use cameras. So for those who are new to advanced CL and do not know what the camera function is, cameras are used just to extract drawings. They're not meant for isolation. They're just meant for the extraction of details, and you can use them for plan views, elevations, as well as connection details. Now, the reason why I prefer not to use model views for connections is simply because it can be difficult to find the model views that you created. So for example, here, if I type in CON1 for connection 1, and now I were to select the connection box. So here, I'm just going to turn on ortho to make it easier to change the size. Okay, so now here we see this box that contours. Notice it's a very similar color to the joint box. Of course, now if I double click, it's going to isolate the connection. And here we have the same options as the other model views. But again, if I want to find this quickly in my project, of course, this is a smaller project, so it's quite easy to find. But if I wanted to find the drawing that links to this camera, of course, I can go here to the list of views, but it can get quite cluttered very quickly with various connections, and it creates a lot more boxes of this type. The cameras make it just a little bit easier to find the specific view because it'll be in a different color. And of course, you can turn these off. Of course, this creates a lot of clutter in your model as well, but you can manage it with the color layers later on. You can turn it off, on and off the camera layers. So here we see cameras. We can just simply turn them off and then turn them on when we need to see. So again, this is sort of this is user preference. This is just personal preference. But this gives you an idea of how to manage your different model views. Now, for this one here, I'm just going to go ahead and erase that. And now we can go ahead and take a look at queries and groups. Now, before actually creating a query, I'm just going to create a group. A group is quite simple to create. First, what you want to do is right-click on the groups category and then create a new group here. So here, I'm going to call this phase 1. And now here to attach items, because of course here I just created a group without essentially attaching anything to that grouping. Here, once we right-click on phase 1, then we're going to have the option to add elements. So here I'm going to go ahead, add elements. I'm going to select all objects here. It's a part of the first floor, and maybe we can just remove the concrete elements. So I'm just going to swipe across here, remove those items. Right click, and now here we can see if we were to toggle on phase 1 and toggle it off, it's just going to show the items that I've selected for that group. Of course, you can add elements after the fact. So here now I've added this wall. So we can see now that's part of that group. And if I wanted to remove an item, here you'll have the option to remove elements just below. Now, if we right click on it, again, you'll have many other options. So here we can mark the elements, we can select the elements. So this can be used to quickly create drawings based off of base. It can also be used to create external lists. Based off a selection, you can mark elements and then use them in combination with some of the other tools here in the selection tab. For example, here now that they're marked, I can go ahead and select them as well. So you have quite a few different options here to manipulate your model by using groups. But this is just personal preference. I prefer to create queries because you can create internal standards for filtering your model in specific ways. You can create your preferred queries and then just save them to your DWT and recycle them for future projects. Okay, for projects moving forward. And of course, you can have different DWTs for different customers. So if you're a detailing firm and you're working with multiple fabricators, you can set up queries, based off of how they like to receive bill of materials and things of that type. So here, let's go ahead and create another group. And we'll just call this group phase 2. So just to repeat the process, phase 2. Now I can go ahead here, add elements. I'm going to select everything here. So part of that second floor. Now we can see those turn on and off. And again, once again, within groups, you can always create new folders. So if I create a new folder here, I can call it phase 2. Oh, or phases, rather. And again, I can drag them and drop them within the phases folder. All right, next, let's take a look at creating queries. So of course we can create queries again by right-clicking. Here we'll have the option to create a query. But I personally prefer to go to the selection tab of your advanced tool palette and create queries from here. So to create a query, it's essentially using the search filter tool. Here, if I were to right-click on queries and create a new query, once again, it'll bring up the search filter tool. Now, the reason why I prefer to go here to the search filter tool is because it'll retain the previous settings that you've applied. Every time you go to create a query from this category, it'll remove your previous filters and you'll have to start from scratch. So, for example, if you wanted to create multiple queries based off of model roles, it's much easier to just set up your preliminary settings for object selection and so on, and then afterwards just go to the category where you'll find the model views option, model roles option, and then just change it from column to beam and things of that type. I'll give you an example in just a bit. But here, we're going to go to the search filter tool. And now here, I'm going to start off by just talking about the general tab. So most users know here, you typically want to filter out based off the complete model, but you can also create queries based off a selection of items or whatever is marked at that point in time. So here, for example, if I go back to phases, I right-click on phase 1 and mark the elements here. So now we can see everything that's a part of phase 1 is marked. I can then go back into the search filter and create it based off of that grouping. So the current mark set now can be used to create this filter, which is interesting. That being said, personally, I like to use variables within the model. So if you have a grouping called phase 1, it doesn't necessarily mean that when you add new elements later on, they're going to be a part of this hypothetical phase 1. Okay, that being said, if you do have an item that has the lot and phase variable of phase 1, that'll automatically be a part of that query. So just to make it simple, here if I were to go and apply a column, okay, and I go ahead and put the variable of phase 1. It won't link to this phase 1 category because, again, it's based off a selection of items. I would have to add this element later. For it to be a part of that filter or that group. So again, I'm going to give another example of this when I create queries, but once you create a query based off a model role or by phase, if you apply an object within your model and change the model role to a similar model role where you have a query created for it, it's automatically going to be a part of that filter or query. And another option that you have here for the search, of course, you can base it off of current selection. So here, if I have, let's say, this top portion of the tower selected, of course, that'll be an option here within the list. Again, it's always best to just filter on the complete model. And here below, you have the options for your marking method. Now, you can just show the results in a dialog, but it's always best to have some sort of visual aid to see what has been searched when applying this this filter. But here you can add to a marking or subtract from a marking. So once again, if I were to right-click on phase 1 and I mark the elements, here afterwards I'll have other options to add to the marking or subtract from the marking. I suggest it's always best to create a new marking so it's quite clear what has been selected when applying the filter. So again, once again, I'm just going to clear the marking here. I'm going to go back to the search filter. And okay, now we're just going to go ahead and just show here that you can assign new colors. Okay, so if you don't want your items to turn red when using the filter, maybe you prefer another color like green, you can always change it there. And now here we have the objects. So for this particular filter, I'm going to keep it simple. So here we're to create filters for model roles, as I suggested earlier. So we're to create a model role or a filter for the columns, and then create another filter for linear items for beams. Now here I'm going to select steel beams, and maybe you'll have timber beams, folded beams that can have similar names. So we'll just keep it simple. We'll just keep those 3 selected. Now here when we go into common properties, of course you can create queries based off of material coding, whatever you'd like, but we're to jump over to the naming category. And then here, we're to start off with creating one for column. Oh, there we go. So once we've selected column, first what you want to do is click OK just to apply the filter and make sure it's working correctly prior to saving. So I'm going to click OK. And now here we can see all the columns are highlighted in green. Now what we'll do is go back. Here I had the item selected. That's why I exited the dialog to make sure it's just based off the complete model. And now here we can see that it's retained my previous search. Okay, so I can just go ahead and save it now. Now I'll call it column. And here we'll see be added to the queries category within the Project Explorer. So you can turn the other items on, off, etc. Now, if I go back here to the search filter, it'll retain the previous settings as I pointed out earlier. That being said, if I were to go here to queries and create a new query, it'll remove all the previous settings. Okay, that's why I prefer to always go to the search filter and create a new query afterwards, because it would have been much easier just to select a new model role as opposed to having to check multiple boxes here. Of course, my query was quite simple, but if you have a granular search created based off of phase and material types within that phase, things of that type, it can be annoying to have to redo all that work. So just going to go back to the search filter here. We're going to remove the current mark set. So again, I'm going to clear the marked objects. Excuse me. And now we're going to go back to objects. Here, click steel beams, timber beams, and folded beams. We're going to check those items off again. And then here under the naming tab, I'm going to create another model role. We're going to call it beams. Now, once again, we're going to click OK to make sure the filter is working correctly. Now we'll see some linear items are not highlighting. Okay, so this is an indication that there's items that maybe forgot to set to the correct model role. So I'm going to leave that alone for now. I'm going to clear the marking, and I'm still going to create this this filter for the beams. I'm going to type in beams or just beam. Say OK. We're going to see it highlight again. You can clear the marking. Of course, we can turn on and off the beams. Now, in this case, we know that there's some linear items here that haven't been set to the correct model role. What you might want to do is create a query for none, the model role of none. So then you can quickly find any sort of user errors. Done. Okay, so here let's just search for none. There we go. Say OK, and now here we'll see those highlights. Now we can save it, call it none. And we can always turn the other items off. Now quickly select those, go into the properties, and then change them to beams if that's what you wanted to change them to. Okay, this is just a basic example, but having a filter created for none can make it easy for you to find issues later on in your project if you made a mistake and haven't set your items to the correct model role. So now if we turn it off and turn it back on, of course, no items will appear. And here we can categorize them. We can just place them all in the folder called model roles. And say OK. Now I'm just going to go ahead, drag them and drop them into that folder. And now we'll go ahead and create another model role, maybe for attached parts, to quickly select all the plates in the project. It's just another example. All right, so here now, and go ahead, just select folded plates, plates here. Say OK. Now we see all the plates are highlighting in green. But maybe we want to isolate those plates based off of phase as well. So here I have these beams that are part of phase 1 and these other items are part of phase 2. If I were to go and apply part marks to my project, it'll also segregate the plates based off of phase 1 and phase 2 because of course they're usually attached, shop attached to those linear items, the beams. So if I wanted to filter out plates based off of phase, now here I can type in phase 1, say OK, and see which items are part of phase 1. Now we see some of these here are part of phase 1 when maybe they shouldn't be. If I were to go here, we do see that's a part of phase 1, okay. So it could have been just here because it's attached to this column, that's a part of phase 1. All the members that are welded in shop to this column, of course, become a part of phase 1 as well. So that filter is correct. Now what I'll do is go ahead and save this, call it plates phase 1. All right, now here we can create a new folder and we'll just call it phases or PL phases. I think this gives you a good example of creating queries and creating your categories and so on. Now let's take a look at how we can save these to your DWT so you can reuse them from project to project. So here I'm going to go ahead and open a new file. And here you can see that I already have one created called GR Graitec Webinar. If I go into this Graitec Webinar folder, we do have a column or a query already predefined called column. Now what I'll do is open a new file and just use the AS template DWT. We'll see everything will be removed. Now if I were to go ahead and create a query, I'm just going to make it simple. We're to create a similar filter from the example that I just showed. So I'm going to select steel beams, just go over to the naming tab, select model roles, and now here I'm going to type in B for beam. Now we can go ahead and save this, call it beam. And now if I were to save this as a DWT, so I'm going to go ahead and save as, and we're going to have to go over to program data and go to the correct folder, excuse me. So here we're to go to our C drive in program data, Autodesk, Advanced Steel 2020, GBR, shared supports, and then here we're to go under templates. That's where we're to find our DWT files, and here we're to go ahead and save this as DWT. Now here we can just call this test 1. We're to save this, close the file, and now of course if I go back to open up a new file, it'll bring me directly to the templates category that we just navigated to. And here we'll find the test1 DWT. When I create a new DWG file, now we can see the queries are saved. Now what happens if you wanted to export this query and import it into your project? So this query here that I have for beams, of course I already have it created in my model management DWG file, but here we're just going to give an example of exporting and importing a query. So here we have the import and export functions. So I'm going to go ahead and export this, and I'm going to save it at this location. Here I already have one called query in the support folder. I'm going to call this query 2. Now I'll go ahead and click OK. So if we were to close this file now, you go here to queries, just right click and create a new query, but then import a query. Here we'll find the XML query 2. And if we were to double click, we'll see it'll save those variables, and now we can save as beam 2. So we can import that filter. So again, this example is more for if you created a query on a new project and you wanted to share your filter with the rest of the team, you can just export it and ask everybody to import it, and it's quite easy to do as you saw here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead, delete this query now. Let's just take a look at the model browser and how we can quickly make modifications here to the model browser to facilitate searching various items. So as you can see here, I have categories or columns of information applied that aren't typical. So here, for example, drawing number, base number, and model role aren't typical. Typically, when you just open this up here and sort by single parts, you'll only see the single part mark, the object name, and the quantities. Now, the model browser you always want to use after you've applied part marks, because then, of course, it'll group items together so you can view the quantities. If you were to open up the model browser prior to numbering, you'll just see each individual item separate. So it should be used after you apply part marks. And of course, here we can filter out based off of assemblies, and then here we can see items and what's involved within the assembly. Of course, here with the model browser, you can select an item, and then here you'll see it selecting your model. You also have other options to isolate that assembly. And of course, because it's selected, you can even right-click and go to the beam properties, the plate properties. You have other options there as well. So first, let's take a look at adding other columns of information. So you saw I was able to remove a column, but here if I want to insert a new column, after right-clicking, we can search or we can add any column of information. So whether it's material, whether it's coding, the naming of the item, etc. So here typically what I like to apply, this is user preference once again, is phase. I also like to apply model roles. And here, another typical one would be drawing number. Now, why I like to add drawing number is because, of course, once the item is linked to a drawing, you can then see what has been detailed and what has not been detailed quite easily. Okay, so we can see obviously here we don't have any objects linked to a drawing yet, so we'll have to come back to that. But this makes it very easy to make a change. Also, if you've forgotten to make a change to an item, let's say, for example, these items that are set to none should be set to a specific model role. Well, here you can actually edit the properties. If I go to edit properties and change this to anything, it doesn't really matter for this case, but I want to change it to flat. So there it does seem to be some sort of flat bar. If I change to flat, now of course I can refresh. It takes a little bit of time when you refresh. Okay, so depending on the change that you make, if it's to just 2 items, you're probably best just to isolate them, right-click on the object to actually access the advanced properties of that item and just make your change within the dialog. But of course, if it's all 10 different items and the phases of those items and they're scattered throughout the model, you might want to just go via the model browser to make those changes. But now here we can see that the item has been changed here to flat in terms of model role. And if I were to go into my model, just right click here and go into the advanced properties, of course we'd see that change here under flat. Okay, so we took a look at editing properties, finding items that are not linked to drawings. Okay, so let's just take a look at that quickly. If we wanted to detail, let's say, this portion here, I'm going to go ahead and create the drawings for those items. Let's create the assembly drawings. Just use an A4 or an A3 type sheet, doesn't really matter. Single with a bill of material. So just take a few more seconds to create those drawings. All right, now if I go to the document manager, of course, we can see that those details have been created. And of course, now if I were to go back to the model browser, here we can go to assembly, so they created the assembly details, of course, insert a column for the drawing number, and then find the drawings that have been created. So now here, if I were to select the element in my project, here we'll see it'll be that standalone item. That's probably a loose item, my project that I would need to modify. You can see that item there as well. And then here we see all the beams. So this one here, B27, 28. Another trick that you can see here, if you find an item that has been detailed, okay? For example, if someone from the shop floor came to you and said, hey, I need a dimension allocated between 2 items on drawing B27 or for assembly B28, whatever the case is, then you can use the model browser to quickly see where B28 is find it quickly in your model, and then just go straight to the assembly detail by right-clicking on the item. It's going to make it very easy to find assemblies and objects, as opposed to going to the document manager and having to scroll through maybe 300 to 500 drawings. It's a very easy way, quick way to find an object. Okay, so let's just give a quick example of extracting an external list with queries. So here, the main benefit to a query, of course, we took a look at isolating objects within our project. So that's one benefit, yes, but of course, afterwards, when you need to create a list for purchasing, here now, if we go to the create list function found in the output ribbon, here we can base it off of the complete model. Here you can also create new filters. So here we have one created for queries, and how I was able to do that just by clicking on new. The new option here. We can create a new category for a filter. Now here we're filtering on the complete model, and we're just utilizing queries that we've created. So if I want just simply the beams or the plates that are part of phase 1, here we'll hit apply and then next. And what I'll do is go and just select simply a material list, click on use, and now here we'll see that new category, new queries. Click OK, and it's applying the beams as well. So that's of course dependent on the bill of material and how that's configured. Okay, so if it's encompassing beams as well, you'll have to remove those items. But here it's not necessarily straight beams; it's encompassing flats here as well. So flats can act as plates depending on how it's set up in your defaults, but just keep that in mind. And here now, let's take a look at creating a drawing from a model view. All right, so once again, we created model views earlier, and we can create cameras now from the model views. This is a new function that was created, I believe, in 2018. So once again, with this grid view here, if I want to create a drawing from that view, what I could do is go to the advanced properties. So select the model view, right-click, go to advanced properties, and then here under the camera properties, we're going to create an automatic drawing. Now here you can set up your filter types and so on for cameras. We're not going to go into that. We don't really have time today. But here, what I'll call this is just EL01. Let's say elevation view 1, or should probably be more specific, EL03 for the grid line 3. We'll just say that. And of course here we can have a drawing style that links to this camera. So I'm just going to select an elevation view. Hot rolled all sides, that should be fine. And then here we can predefine our scale, but we can always change the scale afterwards in the drawing, so that's not a big deal. Now here I'm going to select the model view, and now if I were to go under processes, of course we can use the camera processes to create this drawing. So here I'm going to go ahead and select camera selected A1. I'm going to click OK. And now if I were to highlight the model view, right click and go to show camera detail, here we'll see it appear. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to show today in terms of managing your model with the Project Explorer and how to quickly make changes with the model browser, etc. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to give about 5 minutes just to go over any questions if you do have any. So please don't hesitate. Feel free to ask. Okay, I don't see any questions here. Okay, well, if there are no questions, we can just stop there for today. Now, just a reminder for those who are interested in learning more about these sorts of things. So model management, database management, the drawing style manager, things that we can't typically show in a basic training because it would just be too much content for 4 or 5 days of advanced steel training. Keep in mind, we can always help you with these sorts of things. Now, this is what we suggest always with advanced steel. You start with a basic training, but afterwards, if you need more help with any sort of implementation, setup of the solution, documentation training and customization. So that's for drawing styles or database management. Keep in mind, we can always help with these sorts of things. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. So again, my name is Tommy Musis, but of course, you've probably spoken to others on our team in the structures division. So Liam Hope, Rob Merriman, Alec Giles, and John Bennett. We're always here to help. So don't hesitate to contact us. Again, thank you very much for joining today, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you, everyone.